Do you find yourself captivated by the inexplicable, entranced by enigmas, and tantalized by the unknown? We are Shane and Josh Waters, brothers who will weave you through tales that have mystified us for years. From haunted hotels to inexplicable disappearances, we dig deep, searching for the truth.
Our episodes offer you a panoramic view of the world's greatest mysteries, leaving no stone unturned, no clue unnoticed.
With a gripping narrative, we invite you to join us on a journey into realms of the unexplained.
We're not just recounting tales, we're unraveling the mysteries that have perplexed humanity for ages, blending fact and storytelling into a mesmerizing tapestry.
So, armchair detectives, curious minds, and seekers of the strange, it's time to put on your headphones and dim the lights.
Dive into the uncanny world of the Mystery Inc. podcast and prepare for a journey into the unknown that you'll never forget.
Subscribe now wherever you listen to podcasts.
And remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved, but not unexplored.
And I just turned around and I hauled ass out of there. I was done. I wasn't dealing with that.
The hypocrisy of the cult is one of the things that turned me away the quickest.
When I turned my headlights on, it turned and looked at us. And one of the things I remember the most were the eyes were glowing red.
I see an orb of light. It is just circling these steps like it is waiting for me.
And he begins to tell them that he saw a UFO. They're basically like, what are you talking about? That's 7 foot up on a tree, peeking around it. And that's where I saw the top of the muzzle, nose, and the eyes. As soon as I made eye contact with this thing, it felt like death.
Welcome back to Tinfoil Tales. I'm your host, Brandon Wright. On tonight's episode, we're going to be joined by my guest, Floyd. Floyd has researched a lot about the red-haired giants and even some of the little people that's been talked about throughout history, some of the biblical terms like the Nephilim, and how it all kind of ties together with these creatures throughout history. Floyd has done a lot of extensive research into that, so he's going to come on here tonight, talk about the book he's wrote, and everything he's kind of come across in his studies for these giant creatures. Before we bring Floyd on, if you've ever had an encounter or experience you want to share, you reach out to tinfoiltalespodcast@gmail.com, and we'll get you scheduled for a future episode. If you'd like to help the podcast, continue to share it around. You can leave a 5-star review everywhere that you listen to podcast at. It helps with the exposure. More exposure means new listeners. New listeners means new encounters and stories. Means new episodes for everyone else to listen to. Make sure to follow us on social media, whichever one you prefer. I'm sure I'm on there. Just give me a follow. You can talk to me on there if you want to. I do have a website out now, so make sure to check out tinfoiltales.com. You can get all the episodes on there as well. We're going to go ahead now and bring Floyd on. If you guys enjoyed the episode, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take this time tonight to welcome my guest onto the show, Floyd. Thanks for coming out here and talking with me.
Hey, Brandon, thank you very much for having me on, and thanks to your audience for tuning in. I think we're going to have maybe a fun and intriguing conversation in the area of giants, and if you want to go down some other rabbit holes, perhaps we can do that.
Definitely always good to explore some rabbit holes, at least on this show.
Right.
So, but yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to talking with you. The giant topic is something that I've been wanting to dive into since I started the podcast. So here we are almost a year and a half later, but I'm ready to finally tackle one.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. And, it's one of those topics that is cross-cultural, and it's talked about in, most cultures throughout the world. It's talked about in the Bible, ancient Sumerian civilization, going back, 5,000 years, talked about giants. The Egyptians talked about giants. In South America, there's been tales and legends of giants. So we should have plenty to talk about.
Sounds very, very interesting. Before we get started, I do have a couple questions.
Sure.
What made you want to look into the giants of all the things out there? Like, what piqued your interest?
That's a great question. I heard a presentation by another researcher named Jim Vieira. This was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and he's done a lot of research into the area of giant skeleton discoveries in North America. And I watched a presentation of his, and I was really intrigued because he kept referencing these old newspaper articles here in America that went back from mid 1800s all the way into the 1970s that talked about these discoveries of giant skeletons, some of them 7 feet tall, 8 feet, 9 feet, even some articles that reference, giants, 15, 16 feet tall. And I thought, this is wild. Like, is this real? And he kept showing these different newspaper articles. And in some of those articles, institutions such as the Smithsonian was referenced. And there was always mention that, the Smithsonian or some other organization would come in and examine the bones, and then they just disappeared. So it was that presentation that really piqued my interest. And I thought, if Jim's finding all these newspaper articles on these weird discoveries, I should be able to just do a little research, and I could come up with some of these, and I could look into this. So that's what I did. I put together a folder and subscribed to a bunch of old newspaper databases, and it didn't take me long to accumulate quite a number of these anomalous articles on these discoveries.
Yeah, I've seen, I don't remember if it's the same guy, but there was a show out there where he was searching for these giants.
Yes, it was Jim Vieira, and he has a brother as well. And they're both stonemasons, and they did have a show on the History Channel. And I don't quite remember the name, if it was In Search of the Giants or something along that line.
Yeah, I remember it was something like that. It was the last couple of years. I think they had at least maybe 1 or 2 seasons.
Yeah, very interesting. I wish they would have been able to produce some more seasons of that. But that was, yes, very interesting show.
The giant lore I've heard from, obviously, you can go back, you've already mentioned it, but like, it's not just an American thing. That's been a worldwide thing. Like, there's always been the myths and the stories and stuff of giants. So,
yes, in most of your cultures, and many of us are familiar with the stories told in the Bible, particularly of David and Goliath. And Goliath was a descendant of the Nephilim. And the Nephilim is a Proto-Hebrew word meaning fallen ones. And Goliath, and he also had brothers too. So in fact, when David killed him with the sling stone later on, David and his mighty men fought some of Goliath's brothers, and they were giants. And in fact, the Bible references one of those giants as having a double row of teeth and 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. So there are a number of references in the Bible, in the canonized version of the Bible, but there's also a tremendous amount of information in some of the books of the Bible that are not canonized that were left out, particularly the Book of Enoch.
The Book of Enoch has a lot of information in there that I feel like I don't know why that was kept out of the Bible unless it was deemed talked about too much weird stuff for them, I guess, to fit into the Bible, because I don't know who decided what books were in the Bible and what books weren't in the Bible.
Yeah, that's a really good really good question that you pose, Brandon. And what's interesting is the more I started digging into the giants in the Bible, I found out that many of the early church fathers actually subscribed to the Book of Enoch. And in the canonized Bible, in Genesis, the Book of Enoch is referenced in there. And Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah. And so for the context of the Book of Enoch, if you look in Genesis, Genesis 6:4, it says, and I'm just paraphrasing this, it says there were giants in the earth in those days and thereafter, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore them children, and they became mighty men, men of renown. And so this weird passage of the sons of God coming into the daughters of men. And so you have to ask yourself, well, who were the sons of God? And if you really look into the Bible and you look at references of sons of God in the Old Testament, it goes back, if you go to Job, it talks about how the sons of God showed themselves. They went before the throne of the Lord, and Satan was with the sons of God. And so you look at that passage and you go, well, those aren't humans that are going before the throne of the Lord, right, with Satan. Those have to be angelic beings. And also in Job, it talks about the laying of the foundation of the earth, and how the sons of God shouted for joy when God did that. Well, humankind hadn't been created then. So who were the sons of God? The sons of God were the angels. And the book of Enoch goes very extensively into the whole backstory of that Genesis 6, and talking about who were the sons of God. And the book of Enoch says they were a group known as the Watchers. There were a group of 200 of them. They were angels, and their job was to watch over humankind and to protect us. But this particular group of angels, they became infatuated with the women of the earth and attracted to the women of the earth, and they swore an oath to have sexual union with the women of the earth. And in fact, the book of Enoch even gets specific and names some of the leaders of this group of 200, Azazel being one of the leaders of this group. And they came down to a place called Mount Hermon, which is in Syria, and Mount Hermon means Mount of Desolation. And these angelic beings, they came down and they took them wives, as it says in Genesis 6, and they had sexual union with human women. And this produced the Nephilim, the giants. The Nephilim means fallen ones. And the book of Enoch talks about not only did these fallen angels intermix their seed with the humankind, but they also taught them the forbidden arts, the forbidden sciences that God did not feel we were ready to have. And those are known as the sacred sciences, or the 7 sacred sciences. And they're talked a lot about in secret societies such as the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians and other secret societies that claim to have knowledge that goes all the way back to this particular time when these extraterrestrial beings, if you want to call them that, they weren't from the earth, came and intermixed with our seed. And then the book of Enoch says that obviously God was not happy with that, and he brought the great deluge, the great flood, to wipe out the earth, to wipe out the race of giants that were intermixing with humankind and destroying the earth. The book of Enoch talks about how they were fighting amongst themselves, they were killing humans, they were drinking blood. Some people believe that's where the origins of the first vampires came from, was from references to the Nephilim, because they would drink blood. And also it appears they were doing some genetic experimentation on the earth. In the book of Enoch, it talks about how they were corrupting plant and animal life. And so God brought the flood to wipe them out, but it didn't kill all the giants. It killed most of them off, but not all. And that's why I think it says in Genesis 6, it said, there were giants in the earth in those days and thereafter. And I believe when it says and thereafter, it means that there were some that were left that survived the flood. And of course, those bloodlines became diluted, as, the years went by. And that's why, we have references of stories like Goliath in the Bible. He was a descendant of the giants. And even though he was huge, he was probably 9 or 10 feet tall, he was one of the smaller ones. And then we have like King Og of Bashan, another giant mentioned in the Bible. He had a 13-foot long bed that was framed in iron. And Moses and his armies killed off King Og. But there's a number of references in the Bible if you know where to look. But I believe the book of Enoch is the whole backstory for Genesis 6. And also, too, there are other books, non-canonized books of Jasher and a number of other books that also talk about the fallen angels, the angels that came down to the earth and they intermixed their seed.
Just not to go off on a completely different topic, but what do you think the reasoning would be for why they don't want to include those stories in the Bible? Do you think there's some sort of reasoning behind it, like when they pick and choose why they didn't want that in there? Because of all the things that's in there, that's it seems strange that they wouldn't mention that. They wouldn't want that considered part of the actual canonized version of the Bible.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, and it's interesting, Brandon, because I did discover that even though it was left out of the canonized versions of the Bible, that many early church fathers believed in the whole story of Genesis 6 is, that these fallen angels came down and they interbred. And in fact, in the Ethiopian church, the Book of Enoch is considered canon, and they kept it in their Bibles. And also, too, the Book of Enoch, copies of those were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm sure you probably heard of those before, some of the most ancient biblical texts.
Mm-hmm.
The Book of Enoch was included in there. But I think even prior to the discovery of the Book of Enoch in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was in the 40s, way earlier than that, there was a British adventurer who went, I believe, to Ethiopia, and he did find some copies of the Book of Enoch and brought them to England. I think this was back in the 1800s, I believe.
I haven't really read the Bible or the Book of Enoch. I've watched stuff, I've listened to stuff and things about it, but for years it always seems like the Book of Enoch is always referenced when it comes to all sorts of different things, because even with, you mentioned like space aliens, people interpret that as they were in the Bible because they were in the Book of Enoch. People say the Nephilim, things like Sasquatch and these other weird cryptid type things were Nephilim. And they reference the Book of Enoch. There's so many different things that continues to go back to the Book of Enoch.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, there's a lot of really strange and interesting things in that book.
Mm-hmm. That seems to be the one thing that I should probably actually sit down and read would be that one, just because of it seems to reference so many different things that we kind of dive into on this show. So
I would really encourage you. Yes, definitely check out the Book of Enoch. And there's a number of other really interesting books too. I think the Book of Jasher is another really good one that talks about the fallen angels.
Well,
and so going back, so we have these biblical accounts that many people are familiar with, but also too, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it's cross-cultural. All these different cultures have mention of giants. And we're even going back to the ancient Sumerian texts, the clay tablets. Have you heard of the Anunnaki?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. And so the ancient Sumerians, they believed that the Anunnaki, they said they came from the heavens, and they depicted the Anunnaki in their clay tablets as giants. And you'll see depictions of these beings sitting on thrones as kings, and they will have a servant standing before their throne, and the king, the Anunnaki sitting on the throne, is just as tall as the person that's standing up before their throne. So if that individual that was sitting down, if they stood straight up, they would be twice the size of their servant. So, could some people say, oh, but that's just symbolic. They just wanted to depict the royalty, as bigger because they were, more important. However, could it also be possible that they depicted them how they saw them, and that they were giants?
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, didn't some of the depictions also look like they had like wings to them in the background? Or am I thinking of something else?
Well, I think there are probably some depictions that have that. There are depictions of the Anunnaki that look like they're in some type of flying machines with wings, and I think that might be similar to what you're referring to. But just think of all the symbolism, though, of these beings, having wings or in what appeared to be some type of vehicle with wings. I mean, what are wings symbolic of, right?
The ability
Someone
to fly.
Yeah, ability to fly. And so, yeah, it's really interesting how you have all these different cultures and they're depicting, the same or similar things with their symbolism. And so we have the Anunnaki and the Sumerian tradition, and the ancient Sumerians said that the Anunnaki came from the heavens, and they pretty much taught them everything they knew. They taught them how to build cities and temples, the giant ziggurats, the stepped pyramids. They gave them their laws. They taught them about astronomy, agriculture, architecture. All their sciences they attributed to these beings that came from the heavens. And they said that the Anunnaki established the whole concept of kingship, the whole concept that, we're going to put this ruler in place, and, he's, they're godlike. They have, communication with the gods, and they're going to rule you. So it's really interesting. And the more I researched on the biblical giants and then looking at the Anunnaki, the ancient Sumerian giants, it is my personal belief that they're probably one and the same, that they're the same types of beings.
You mentioned earlier about the 2 rows of teeth and the 6 fingers and the 6 toes. I've heard that a lot with recent accounts of giants. And I don't know, I'm not 100% sure of the story's accuracy or whatever, but recently, within the last, I'd say 15, 20 years, there's the story of the giant of Kandahar or whatever.
Right.
And I don't know if that's authentic or just completely made up. I mean, I obviously wasn't there, but the description was the same, basically. I think it had red hair, it had 2 rows of teeth, the 6 fingers, and the 6 toes.
Yes.
So,
you are correct. Yeah. And I didn't include that story in my book, although I found it very interesting. In fact, when I first found out about that story, it was a military guy who supposedly was involved in the killing of that giant in Kandahar, Afghanistan. And the backstory of it is that there was allegedly this giant in a very remote area, Kandahar, and it, as you said, it had red hair, it had the 6 fingers on the hands and the 6 toes on the feet, just right out of the biblical description. And the local villagers in that area, they worship this thing as a god. And apparently, some of our soldiers encountered it, and it killed that unit of soldiers. And then another unit was sent in, and they cornered this giant at a cave, and they shot it and killed it. Apparently, as the story goes, it had a giant spear, and it skewered a number of soldiers before it was killed. And it took a lot to bring the giant down. And so I've been asked before, well, do you think that's a true story, or do you think that's possible? And basically, I don't know. I would need more evidence. I mean, I watched the video of this alleged soldier recounting what had happened. And at the time, I sent the video to one of my best friends who was a Army intelligence officer, and he had been trained in interrogation and all that stuff. And I said, hey, Eli, could you take a look at this? And what do you think, what this guy's saying? But in the video, the gentleman's face was blacked out. But my friend listened to the guy's basic story. And I said, well, what do you think? And he goes, I can tell you this, that man believes what he's saying. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but he said he definitely believes what he was saying in the interview. And I thought that was interesting. And so do I believe that giant was real and that happened? I'll say I would need more evidence. It very well could have happened. It's within the realm of possibility. And I would even pose that there could be giants that still exist. I mean, in the form of, things such as Bigfoot or Sasquatch, whatever name you want to call it. And I've met people that have had personal encounters. I live out here in Washougal, Washington, and out this way, it's, as you go further, especially further east of where I'm at, you get into the gorge and, you get out towards, Mount Hood and, between Oregon and Washington and those areas, there's tons of sightings of Bigfoot and those accounts, these creatures were, 8 feet, 9 feet, 10 feet tall.
Yeah, I've talked to quite a few people with Sasquatch sightings and stuff, and that's always been something that's fascinated me, even as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always kind of been skeptical on the fact, just because something that large and that like the way we explore and everything is like, how can it not be discovered? But the more I've been diving into the things, I'm like, well, I do see it plausible, just because
Right.
we think we know everything. We think we've discovered everything. There is so much vastness just in our country and the Canada and everything else. Like,
Yeah.
it's so plausible that there could be something undiscovered out there that we're just not aware of. And that could be this. And even with Sasquatch, there's all sorts of weird lore that kind of goes with them, as far as, like, I say the woo part of it for the woo-woos, but basically, like, people say they just disappear. Some people think they see orbs around them, the eyes that glow. Like, there's all sorts of strangeness to them. So, and that's where it goes back to with the whole Nephilim thing. Like, they would have this fallen angel blood. So it would give them this weird ability somehow.
Well, you bring an interesting point, because, I mean, even the Bible says in Genesis 6, it said, that the sons of God came into the daughters of men, which means they had sexual union, and they bore them children, and they were mighty men, men of renown. So that term mighty men, used in the Bible, a number of different places, I mean, that means like of extraordinary ability. I mean, we're talking like when you think of, I don't know, like modern day, like superheroes, like the Marvel and the DC movies are real popular. I mean, back then in the ancient times, those would be like the mighty men of renown. And if you going back to like cross-culturally, like, all these similarities, like between the ancient Sumerians, where they talk about the Anunnaki, and then you have the Nephilim of the Bible. Well, then you have stories of like the Greek Titans, right? In Greek mythology. And the Titans were giants, and they fought the gods, and they lost, and they were imprisoned where? They were imprisoned in the earth, in the volcanoes, underneath the earth. In the book of Enoch, it talks about the Watchers and how they were imprisoned. They were imprisoned in the earth. And what's interesting in the book of Enoch is it talks about the Nephilim that were killed, their spirits remained on the earth, and they haunt the earth. And many people believe that, especially the references of demons in the Bible, are the actual spirits of the Nephilim. Those are the spirits of the old ones.
Yeah, I've heard that theory too, where people believe that these spirits, these demons, were actually like the remnants of the Nephilim. Like, it's their spirits still haunting. And
yes.
I guess it comes back to like when certain things, like if you're thinking demonic and you're thinking demons, and it almost seems like all these things would be evil, because that's like the stereotypical thing you think of when you think of demons. You think of evil, the devil.
Yes.
Like,
yep.
So, and that's where I get almost on the fence about it, because I'm like, if there's a flesh and blood Sasquatch and it's running around, and if it's evolved from whatever, are they all evil? Like,
right. I'm with you. I'm with you. And, like my personal view is, like, when I think of things like the Sasquatch, I wouldn't think of that as a Nephilim. I mean, we're finding, just within the past 20 years, just in the field of archaeology, paleontology, we're finding new hominid species that interacted and in some cases interbred with our ancient ancestors. I don't know if you've heard of the Denisovans.
No, I haven't heard that one.
Okay, so they were first discovered in 2010 in a cave in Siberia. Some archaeologists were doing work in a cave, and they found a giant tooth. It looked like a human tooth, but it was twice the size of a human tooth. And they found some knuckle bones and some other artifacts that were in this cave. which were interesting. One was a green stone bracelet that had 8 millimeter holes drilled into it. And the bracelet dated back 40,000 years, which was pretty incredible to have an ancient artifact like that. And you have these little 8 millimeter holes that had been drilled through the bracelet. Probably there was some type of thread that was through the holes at one time, and they had decorated it with whatever little bones or whatever they decorated the bracelet with. And anyway, so the paleontologists did tests on the tooth and on the knuckle bones, and they did the genetic sequencing and found out that it was a whole new hominid species. So we're all familiar with the Neanderthals, and now we're finding out that the Neanderthals interbred with our ancient ancestors. In fact, most of us have Neanderthal DNA in us. The vast majority of us do. And now they found this other hominid species, and they named them the Denisovans. And now they're finding in populations in Asia and even over in Europe and in North America, in the Native American populations, some of this DNA evidence of the Denisovans. And what was interesting about this discovery is that not too long ago, a full Denisovan skull was found in China. And there's an interesting story to this because the discovery was made back in the 1930s. There was a guy that was doing construction work. He was under forced labor by the Japanese who had occupied that particular area of China at the time. And he uncovered this giant skull and he hid it. He put it in the bottom of a well. And this man lived to a very, very old age. And on his deathbed, he revealed to his kids, hey, I found this skull all these decades ago, and here's where I hid it. And so his kids went, retrieved this skull, and they gave it to the local university, who then did the DNA testing on the skull. They hadn't seen a skull like this before. It's massive. It's like a football-shaped skull, huge eye sockets, very protruding brow ridges. Much larger and more robust than a normal, Homo sapien skull, and way bigger than a Neanderthal skull. And so they did the DNA testing on it. They determined that it matched the DNA sequencing of the giant tooth and the knuckle bones that were found in Siberia. So they've determined that this skull is a Denisovan skull, and they call it Homo longi, which means dragon skull. And some researchers believe that this other hominid species were 7.5 feet tall on average. They were giants. And they intermixed not only with Neanderthals, but some of them were still around when our ancient ancestors were around. And there was all this interbreeding going on between our ancestors, the Neanderthals, and the Denisovans.
Yeah, I haven't even heard that before. I'm going to have to look into that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I talk a lot about it. I write a lot about it in my book on the Denisovan discovery. And I pose the question, well, could the Denisovans be, could this be evidence of these giants, that had interacted with our ancestors? And then that's where you have a lot of these legends that also come from, about giants. So I don't just stick with one theory. I put out, here's what is contained in the Bible, what it says about the giants, and here's what the ancient Sumerians say about the Anunnaki. Could these giants be, the biblical Nephilim or the Anunnaki, or could they be, just another different, species of us, that interbred with our ancestors? So I don't stick with just one track. I just present evidence as I accumulated it and just put it out there for the readers to make their own conclusions.
Yeah. That's kind of how I am with my show. Like, I have people come on here and they talk and everything, and I'm not out here to prove or disprove anyone. I'm just
right.
Everyone can come up with their own assumptions, but if you're doing the research and you have the books out there and your findings and everything else,
yes,
that's you've done the work. So who's to argue with that?
Right. You're just sharing. My whole goal on writing my book, which is The Red-Haired Giants of Lovelock Cave and Other Ancient Mysteries, was just to, share information that I discovered on the giants and other interesting topics in hopes that other people would build upon, my work. and they would go more in depth and maybe explore some areas at deeper levels than I did. And so it's just kind of putting that knowledge out there into the knowledge base and hoping that people continue to build on that.
You mentioned, did you say Lovelock Caves?
The Lovelock Caves, that's the central story. And those caves are in Nevada. And there's a Paiute tradition, a northern Paiute tradition, that there were a race of giants. And then we're going back, we were talking earlier about the red hair. These Paiutes said that these giants had red hair, and they were very violent. They were cannibals. They would attack the neighboring tribes, and they would cannibalize their victims. And this went on for a long time, and finally the Paiutes got tired of being attacked, and they allied with other native tribes in that area, and they waged a war on these red-haired giants that lasted over 3 years, culminating in a final battle at Lovelock Cave, where the last of the red-haired giants were cornered, and the Paiutes threw brush in front of the cave. They lit flaming arrows, and then they burnt the giants to death.
Yeah, I've heard that story before. And again, the giants are red hair, and I've heard the versions where they had the 6 fingers and the 6 toes on each hand and foot.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, it's interesting. So in my book, I provide photographs in there of some of the artifacts that came out of the cave, and even some of the skulls. Now, allegedly, there was, I think, like around 50 some mummies, skeletons that came out of the cave, but they disappeared. They were never put on public display. However, I find this really intriguing and mind-blowing. When I was going through the old archaeological accounts of the first excavation done at that cave, which was in 1911, there were 2 guano miners, and guano is bat dung. These guys were mining bat dung out of the cave, and they found all these artifacts and giant skeletons, and then, of course, they reported it to the local university, and then a year later, in 1912, excavations were done by a archaeologist named Loud was his last name, and he went and conducted these excavations. And in his records, he said that the largest specimen of the mummies was given to a fraternal lodge to be boiled and used in initiation purposes. And I thought, that is crazy. Like, what is going on here? Like, most, these skeletons were never put on public display, but yet here it's saying in the records that the largest of these skeletons were given to a fraternal lodge to be used in ritual purposes. So I started investigating that track, which led me to some local fraternal lodges that were in that area at that particular time in the early 1900s. And in fact, one of them is still there, which is the Masonic Lodge. And so I started looking into the Masonic Lodge and to see if there was any connection, like any history of the Masons using human remains in any of their rituals. And surprisingly, I did uncover some information that there has been Masonic rituals conducted that used human bones. In fact, there were some Masonic lodges in Australia, probably 15, 20 years ago, that got into trouble because there were some workmen that were renovating the lodges there, and they noticed that there was these human skulls and other bones there. So they reported it to the police, and the police did their investigation and come to find out that these Masonic lodges were using human bones in their rituals, but they were Aboriginal bones, I believe, that they were using. So there is a history that human remains, were used, at least in some of these lodges. And so then I was thinking, well, what connection? Like, why would they do that? What is the symbolic, meaning of that? And, were they using these human bones, like any human bones that they can get their hands on? Or was there like a specific significance to acquiring like a giant skeleton? And if that was the case, why? Why did they want to, have this giant skeleton and use it in a ritual? And so then I discovered the works of another researcher named Gary Wayne. He wrote a book called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and he goes in depth, basically connecting a lot of these secret societies like the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians and other secret societies that trace their knowledge base going all the way back to the ancient mystery schools, going all the way back to the fallen angels, the Nephilim.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I don't know the exact term to use. I'd say similarities, but I think there's a lot of same connections, I guess, between when it comes to the giants. And this is me with my tinfoil hat here. When it comes to like the skeletons and everything else, I always feel like there's a lot of connections when it comes to the Smithsonian and the mysteriously these giant skeletons come up missing. Like,
Yes.
I don't, and even back before that, I've always heard other tales that basically people were discovering giants years and years ago, and Catholic Church were taking them as well.
Yes, I've heard those stories. I even reference a few of them in my book. I write I write on this particular article, and I include the article in the book of this guy who was a rancher, and this was in Arizona, and I believe it was back in the 40s. He discovered a giant skeleton, human skeleton with a massive skull, and the newspaper article, like the title of it said, Smithsonian tries to procure giant skull from from rancher, and the man refuses. So even like the very title of the article, it was basically saying, yeah, these Smithsonian agents wanted to procure this skeleton of this skull, which was interesting because the Smithsonian, will publicly come out and say, oh, there was never such a thing as giants. That's all just made up or misidentified bones. But yet I include this article that goes into detail of 2 Smithsonian agents being dispatched to this guy's ranch and trying to procure this giant skull. And in the article, it said that the agent said that the skull was it was so large, it was beyond human comprehension. And they took photographs of it. They took measurements of it, but the man refused to give him the skull. Rightly so. I don't blame him for not turning that over, because then he would have never saw it again. So the Smithsonian didn't end up with it, but then the article never says what happened to it. And, I don't know if it's in maybe someone's private collection or what happened to that skull.
I always thought it was interesting that throughout, I know the last, let's say almost 100 years at least, but the Smithsonian, it seems like they've been collecting a lot of these weird skeletal remains at least from what people have reported. And
right.
What's the point? Like, what are they? It's like they're hiding it at this point because they get them and they don't ever admit to them. And then what are they doing with them? They destroy them. They keep them for hidden in a basement.
Right.
It's strange to me that if this is something that's real, what's the big secrecy about it? And I could say the same thing, like goes back to the whole Sasquatch thing. Like, what's the big secrecy? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a number of different theories, and I could just speak on the whole thing with the giants. I'm not sure on the Sasquatch side of it, but there's a thing called I believe it's called knowledge filtration, and I first learned the term from a great researcher, a gentleman named Michael Cremo. He wrote a book that I read years ago called Forbidden Archaeology, and that book was just filled with documented cases of just anomalous, human constructed artifacts being found at strata levels that would indicate they were millions of years old, which totally contradicts what we've been taught. We're taught that our ancestors go back, maybe 300,000 years ago, and not much further than that. And of course, you had these other hominid species like the Denisovans or whatnot that go back probably 500,000 years ago, and you have Neanderthals. But, and so this book was filled with just these documented cases of just these anomalous finds. And Michael Cremo in his book, he used a term called knowledge filtration. And knowledge filtration basically means that anything that you experience that falls outside of what you've been trained or what you've been taught in, it's almost like a dogma. Like if you encounter something, if you find artifacts or you find a skeleton that just doesn't fit in the way that paleontology or archaeology tells you it should fit into this box and it doesn't fit into the box, then you automatically just filter it out. You just like, okay, this doesn't fit in with what I've been taught. So it's just a lot easier just to crate this stuff up and let's just stick it in a basement or a warehouse. I mean, I think of like the first Indiana Jones movie. Remember at the end of that movie when Indiana Jones, he said, well, what happened to the Ark? And the guy told him, hey, oh yeah, we got our top men working on it. And then the next scene, it flashes and it shows the Ark just being put in a crate, and it's just stacked up with all these other crates in a giant warehouse somewhere.
Yeah, I remember that too. I actually just watched that sometime earlier this year. Again, I haven't seen them a lot of times, but it's been a while since I watched it. I remember getting to the end of it, and there's like a big old row, like warehouse at the end of where they're putting it. It's funny. I was like, I wonder how true that actually is.
Exactly. I think there is some truth. So I think at least in part of it, it's knowledge filtration. If it's things that they go against the theories of our times, the theories of our age, and these theories are supported with a lot of money. Much of which is public money and private money, and all of a sudden you've uncovered something that can totally upend what you've been taught for decades and decades, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we found something here that could completely rewrite history and is counter to the narrative that we've been pushing. So that can be a very dangerous thing. And with knowledge filtration, I think it also puts a lot of these researchers, these archaeologists, these paleontologists, these anthropologists into a position where if they were to come forward and divulge some of these anomalous finds that they come across, that their career could be jeopardized. And I actually give an example of that in my book of a lady that was an archaeologist, Virginia Steen McIntyre, who did some work on an ancient site in Mexico back in I believe it was in the 1960s. And they dated this site. They found human artifacts, they found bones, they found projectile points. And she dated this site back like, I don't know, like something like 400,000 years, something like that, 400, 500,000 years, using a number of different dating methods. And that totally, if that was true and that was human habitation with, hominids that make spear points and tools and everything, that would completely blow out of the water what we've been taught in history. And she was brave enough. Some people would say foolish. I say brave. She came forward. She published her results in the early 1980s, and she was ostracized. She lost her job, and she was basically kicked out of the field of archaeology and never was able to come back to that field again.
That's kind of strange that if you're doing the research, you can verify things and then they ostracize you from it. It's like the good old boy system. Like, oh, you didn't, we got to keep it this way. We can't have change. Don't want anything to rock the status quo.
That's precisely it. That's precisely it. And I do believe it comes down to a lot of knowledge filtration. And, I think, sometimes I wonder too, Brandon, that, is the dam, is this knowledge filtration dam, is it cracking? Is it eventually just going to break? Is it going to get to a point where they just can't cover this stuff up anymore, and you're going to have more and more people coming forward, bringing forth this information, and pretty soon, the dam is springing leaks left and right, and then eventually it's going to break open.
I think with what you're doing, and I don't want to act like I'm doing a whole lot here, but I feel like I'm somewhat helping by giving people a platform to talk about.
Absolutely. That's a huge thing.
More people listen, and the more people start questioning. They keep looking for answers. They keep digging into it. Someone else might hear this and want to dig into it themselves. So again, you're going to get more people looking into these things. It is going to be harder to contain it. But
yes,
with the rise of technology, with the internet, and with obviously stuff on TV, I still think is they're not 100% accurate on the TV. I think they're more for entertainment purposes than anything.
Sure.
But
yeah,
it's starting to get people to start to look into things, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing at all, because when more people are looking into stuff, then more truths will be found at some point.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was thinking of a program that I watched. This was back in the early 1990s, and it had a number of different researchers. Graham Hancock, are you familiar with him?
Yeah, he just had that show come out this past.
Ancient Apocalypse.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So he was on there, and this was back in the early 90s. And then another big researcher that I had mentioned earlier, Michael Cremo. And they were talking about, just these anomalous finds, and they were talking about how the pyramids were, much, much older. The Sphinx was much, much older than we've been told. And they were attacked. They were viciously attacked by, all these different fields, in archaeology and anthropology. But now, this is decades later, there's more and more evidence to support what these researchers had first brought out in the 1990s. So I think, it's taken a long time, but I think we are moving in the right direction. I remember Graham Hancock talking about a site called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Have you heard about that site?
Yeah, I've heard the name. Is that the one that was underground that they discovered?
Yeah, it was buried. It's like a megalithic structure. It has these giant stone circles with, stones going up 15 feet high, and they have like a T shape at the top, and they have all these intricate carvings on these pillars that of animals that are not from that area, and some of them are extinct. They're no longer walking the planet. And they've only uncovered like 5% of this site, and it's been excavated since the 90s. They've only uncovered 5%, and they're dating the site back 12,000 years ago, which totally blows out of the water what we've been taught about our ancestors. Because 12,000 years ago, everyone was just hunter gatherers, just very primitive. We didn't have the ability to construct these megalithic sites. And in fact, the researchers at Göbekli Tepe, they say that site, that whole site, was a temple. It was a gigantic place of worship. It wasn't like a city or anything where people lived. They didn't find any ovens or any other type of indication that there was like a permanent settlement there. That this huge structure that they've only uncovered very little of, who knows how much bigger it is or how far it goes down, was an ancient place of worship. It was a temple 12,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've seen. I watch a lot of Ancient Aliens too, and they talk about that on there. And they also talk about the one in South America. I think it's Peru with the.
Oh, right. Sacsayhuaman, those giant walls, and it looks like the giant pieces of a puzzle just fit together perfectly. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then some of those, the cuts on them are so you can't even slide a piece of paper. They're so like pushed together. And
that's right. We couldn't do that now. We couldn't duplicate that now. So thousands of years ago, like how did they do it? I've been to some pyramids in Mexico, a number of different pyramids. One of the ones that really stands out to me is Teotihuacan outside of Mexico City, which means the place where men became gods. And there's these two giant pyramids. There's a pyramid of the sun and the pyramid of the moon. And there's a roadway that connects the two, called the Aztecs called it the Road of the Dead. And they're flanked by other smaller pyramids. But that was such an amazing site to go to. The pyramids were so gigantic, and this was a place where you could climb the pyramids. You could actually walk up the steps. And I noticed, Brandon, that the steps were so steep that it was like they weren't made for a human stride. It was like they were made for giants.
Now, I've talked about this on several episodes, but I always go back to, it's always interested me that there's pyramids in Egypt, there's pyramids in South America.
Yep.
There's pyramids, I think, in China.
And
there's also probably some in other places too, but none of these people lived anywhere in the same area. So how did they all learn to build pyramids? Like, that's the one thing I've always questioned is like, where did they get the knowledge to build these pyramids, and why were they building pyramids in general? Like, of all things to build, it's strange that they're separated by thousands of miles, but yet they're building
Yes.
similar structures.
Yes, that's a great question. I think that in ancient times there was a lot more extensive travel than we've been told, and I refer to specific situations like have you heard of the cocaine mummies of Egypt?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, there were some mummies, and these were ancient Egyptian mummies that were found to have had cocaine in their system. Now, back in that time, thousands of years ago, the only place you can get cocaine was in the New World, right? It was in like South America.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's things like that. There's so many similarities, just like you were saying. All these different cultures that were spread out across the world. Like, why was everyone making pyramids? I mean, we even have structures here in North America, Cahokia in Illinois. I went there a few years ago. It was an ancient Native American site, and they have a giant earthen pyramid there. They called it Monk's Mound, and it's just gigantic. And they have these stairs that you can go up. And at one time, that area was a whole Native American city. There was over 10,000 people that lived there. And they had these earthen pyramids in it, and on top of the pyramids, they had these wooden, like, longhouse structures that they had there. I never learned about any of this stuff when I was in school. Not at all. It was a very thriving, very advanced civilization that lived there. And I got to see some of the artifacts that were found there and the artwork that these people did, the carvings that they did, just absolutely amazing. And yeah, you look all over the world and there's pyramids all over. I was on the Canary Islands about 16 years ago, the islands off the coast of Spain. And I had no idea at the time, but I was just exploring the islands, and they have pyramids. They have step pyramids on those islands, and they don't know who built them or why they built them, but they were there. The pyramids of Guaymar, I think, is what they're called. And they're little step pyramids. They're not near as large as like the step pyramids like over in Mexico or anything, but they were similar in some ways, but just on a smaller scale. But yeah, you will find these pyramids all over. And some people will tell you that the pyramids are linked to the symbolism of the mountains, and for many ancient cultures, the mountains are considered sacred. And like in the Bible, you'll have where different characters of the Bible will meet God up in the mountains, like when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and he was given the 10 Commandments. It was up in these sacred mountains. And then you have stories in the Bible, like of the Nephilim coming, or the Watchers, I should say, coming down and interbreeding with the women. Where did they come down? They came down to a mountain, Mount Hermon. So many of these ancient cultures, a mountain is symbolic. It's like a connection. It represents like a connection of joining of the earth into the heavens. And so some researchers will say these pyramid structures were kind of like an artificial mountains, so to speak, and they were very sacred places, very spiritual places. But like I was telling you about in Mexico, Teotihuacan, those pyramids there, a number of years ago, there was a sinkhole that opened up at that site, and an archaeologist, Indiana Jones style, roped down the hole and found a whole underground complex of tunnels underneath there with all kinds of artifacts down there. But the most interesting thing he found were these spheres that were underneath there, and they contained liquid mercury.
That's an interesting thing to be finding down in the bottom of liquid mercury.
It is very interesting because with liquid mercury, and I write about this in my book, and in fact, you may have seen the episode, because I remember, Brandon, you said you like watching Ancient Aliens, and that's where I saw this, where they did an experiment. There was a scientist, he had like this track. It was like a magnetic track, and they had a little puck, and they had filled it with a substance that was equivalent to liquid mercury. Now, they actually didn't use liquid mercury because it's so toxic, they didn't want to endanger anybody there. So they used something that was equivalent to liquid mercury, and the scientists got it cold enough to where it produced what's called 0-point gravity. It actually over a magnetic field, that little puck floated up in the air, and it started to float around this track, completely levitating. And they even stuck, I don't know if you remember seeing that episode, but they even stuck an object in front of this little floating puck, and the puck went around it. It went around the object, continued to go around the track. And one of the guys from Ancient Aliens, he asked the scientist, he said, well, do you think it's possible that if, you could create a craft that would be powered by liquid mercury, and if you were able to continually keep that liquid mercury cold enough that it could produce these anti-gravity properties? And the scientist said, yeah, it's in the realm of possibility.
I'm trying to remember the episode. I vaguely think I kind of remember it, but
yeah, I would think it was like I don't know if it was in the earlier seasons.
Yeah.
I remember either season 1 or season 2. It was early on.
There's been so many, it's hard to keep track these days.
Right, I don't even know what season they're at now. They've got to be up there.
They there's one thing on there that I've always kind of wondered about, but they have all this information, they're releasing it to the shows and everything else, but like, I don't know if people are taking it seriously to an extent, because I feel like a lot of people, even that I know, like the show's been on now for at least 15 years, if not longer.
Yeah, it's been on a long time.
And all the stuff that they've talked about, I feel like they start talking about some of the same stuff here and there. Again, they've always mentioned the same similar things.
Sure.
But is it really getting people out there to do this? Like, it might influence a couple people here and there. Obviously, it's kind of had a little influence on me for wanting to look into things. But
is it?
How much is it really, with it being on TV? And again, this is me being kind of a conspiracy nerd.
Right.
I don't think they're going to release too much information on the TV, if that makes sense. Like, they might put some stuff out here and there, but if they're saying you can make a hovering craft with mercury, and well, you're just giving away ideas to other people to try and make their own little hover, high energy floating device. So
if they're putting it out there, I believe that the technology, this type of technology exists, and it has existed for a long, long time. Our military, I believe, has it. Lately, there's just been so much disclosure coming out from these intelligence officers and footage being released about, these crafts that are just going, moving in ways that just completely defies science. And the question is, though, why is all this coming out now? Why is the government bringing all this stuff out now? I don't know if you heard about the Mexican Congress here about a month ago.
The little mummies.
Brought the little mummy out there, and people were kind of ridiculing that, and which is interesting because I write about the Nazca mummies in my book. I include a section on them, and I researched them about 5 years ago. I contacted the institute in Peru that has these mummies, and I asked permission to publish some photos and to share some of their research into these mummies. And it's just interesting that, 5 years later, just now, they're starting to, put it forth to the public. Now, what becomes of it, I don't know. Some people are ridiculing, saying, "Oh, this thing's fake," and it looks like, E.T. from the Steven Spielberg movie. But I would just be hesitant and to either, on either side of it, to jump the gun and say, oh yeah, this is definitely proof of an extraterrestrial. I wouldn't go that route. On the other hand, I wouldn't automatically dismiss it and go, okay, this thing is just fake. Although there have been obviously a number of cases in the past where there have been fakes. I've looked at a lot of these studies that have been conducted on these mummies for years now, and they've had bone specialists, they've done DNA testing. A number of doctors from all over the world have looked at these things, and they can't disprove them. They can't say, oh, some ancient culture fuse these together, glue them together with animal bones and human bones to make them look like they do. They haven't been able to prove that that's been done. So what they have here is really anomalous, mummies that they can't explain.
I saw a local news story, and I don't remember what state it was from or anything about it like that, but they were laughing right when this happened and poking fun at it. I was like, mainstream media is over here, local nobody news station is talking about this, and they're laughing about it on air. I was like, that's just a way of discrediting it, even if it's true or not true. Like the news is making it. The news is 100% trying to discredit it instantly.
Well, and that should automatically raise some questions there. Like, well, if the mainstream is just, ridiculing it, maybe it needs to be looked into more, especially given the past 4 years, what we've been through. And I believe, how the media amongst others have manipulated our society. I think people should do their own research. You should question everything. Doesn't mean you have to believe everything, but go do your own research. Don't depend on, some news pundits poking fun at something that they know nothing about. Am I saying that these discoveries are legit? They're real. They're ETs. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of scientific information on them that has not been able to disprove them, that they're hoaxes. And so, could they be ETs? It's very possible. Could they be another species, undiscovered species that have been, walking on this planet, thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, that we've just now discovered? That could be possible as well.
You'd mentioned you'd study like the little people.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any validity to like the Aborigines, like over in the Australians? I've always heard tales of like hobbits, is what they called them. I thought it was.
Oh my gosh! Yes, there is legitimacy in many people. I've asked many people about this. A lot of people don't know about it, but in the early 2000s, on the Isle of Flores in Indonesia, there were a race of little people discovered little skeletons in a place called Lovelock Cave on the Isle of Flores. And archaeologists found this little skull and these bones and all these tools, these projectile points and other tools in this cave. And they found this little skull, and they tested they did the testing on the teeth, and it had the wisdom teeth. And so this little person was determined to be a female. Once they found the rest of the skeleton, they could tell by the pelvic area, it was a little taller than 3 feet tall. And so that raised a tremendous amount of controversy because, some paleontologists were saying, oh, these little skeletons that you're finding, they had to have some type of disease like microcephaly or some other disorder that would make them be so small. But after a lot of testing, it was determined that they had no disease like that these were a race of little people. And they were even named the Flores Hobbits. And they were not much taller than 3 feet, and they were highly intelligent. They knew how to make projectile points and tools. They knew how to make fire, and they even hunted Komodo dragons that were on that island. I mean, how incredible is that? These little people, 3 feet tall, going after these Komodo dragons that are huge, have poisonous bites, right? Their saliva is poisonous, and they can move very quick for short distances. And I imagine, 40,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, or further back, when these little hobbits existed, and there's debate on how far they go back. When did they die out? Was it 40,000 years ago? Was it, much older than that? But they were actually hunting these Komodo dragons. So we have in the archaeological record evidence of these little people out of Indonesia. And not only that, but I believe here in North America, there's been bones that have been found. There was a researcher named Dr. Barry Fell. He did a lot of good work in the 70s and 80s. And he primarily focused a lot on North America and these ancient, unusual archaeological sites here in North America. And there's a lot of them. A lot of people don't know about them. America Unearthed. Have you ever watched that series on the History Channel with Scott Walter?
I think I've watched a couple episodes here and there.
Yeah, he really goes in depth. He kind of picked up the work of Barry Fell and just really rolled with it. And Scott Walter, he's a geologist, and I really have a lot of respect for him and the work that he's done. But going back to Barry Fell, I remember I have reading a book of his. I think it was called there's America BC, and that book is just filled with documentation how ancient travelers came here to North America, everything from the Celts to the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, just a number of different ancient peoples having came to North America long before Columbus ever showed up here. And in one of his books, I think it was Bronze Age America, he's got a picture of him holding a skull of a pygmy skull that was found somewhere in, I believe it was in Tennessee. It was found in a mound, which was interesting because most of the Native American tribes throughout North America, they have tales of giants and the little people.
I've heard recently, I've interviewed someone, and they obviously there's other topics too. Like there's lore out in like Massachusetts area for like they call them puckwudgies, like the little people of the forest. And I interviewed someone this past summer where they had an encounter years back in Florida with a small humanoid person, and it almost goes into the whole. It's like cryptid lore to an extent, but at the same time, it's like there are a lot of reports of people seeing little people. And to me, it's always interested me because where I live at, there's an old battleground not too far from here. And when I was in high school, everyone used to call it Hobbit Land because some people went out there, and like the local legends are like that people went out to the reenactment areas, but they've seen little people living in the woods, like little. And there's a park down in Anderson, Indiana, the Mound State Park. There's all sorts of little people stories from people seeing these little things in the Mound State Park. So the little people stories have always interested me.
Yeah, I've heard of some of those tales that you spoke of, Brandon, and I also uncovered some our newspaper articles as well, which I include in my book, talking about the little people. I met a podcaster. I was on her show talking about my book, and she had actually had an encounter with a little person. She told me she was with her niece, and she was walking through some wooded area, and they look over and they see this little person, and she said it had like old-fashioned clothes, and it had a little broom, and it was sweeping, and she was stunned, and she just kind of looks at her niece, and her niece looks at her, and she asks her niece, she goes, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" And she goes, "Yeah, that's a little person." And then they both look over at this little person, and then she said it was almost like it looked up at them like to acknowledge them, and then it kind of went back to sweeping, and then she said it was transparent, you could see through it, and then it just disappeared.
Yeah, it's interesting with the whole disappearing thing. It seems to be a common phenomenon when it comes to these encounters with a lot of things. Honestly, it's like you see them and all of a sudden they disappear.
Yeah, is it like the question is it like some residual energy to something that once existed there, or is it like a parallel dimension kind of thing, like one bleeding over another?
That's kind of where I'm starting to lean into, is the whole bleeding of dimensions, because maybe these things vibrate at a different frequency from ours to where when people take photos, they're always blurry. Well, maybe these things vibrate so much to where the photos don't pick them up. I don't know. I mean, I guess that makes sense to me. I don't know if it makes sense to anyone else, but it's a different, like everyone has their own energy. We all have our own frequencies, our own vibrations.
Yes.
So maybe these, whatever they are, have their own ones. It's not from what we're used to. And our eyes can only see so much of the spectrum as it is. So maybe these things live in an area that we can't see.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely hold that within the realm of possibility in my mind. I mean, you have things like Skinwalker Ranch, where you have all kinds of just high strangeness happening in these particular areas that the Native Americans talk about, back, hundreds of years ago, saying that there was this weird stuff going on.
Yeah, the whole Skinwalker Ranch thing is very strange to me, especially with the fact that the original story of the area that happened, and then Bigelow owning it, and I don't think he owns it now, it's someone else, but they did so much government research on it and everything.
Yes.
The whole area definitely has some weird phenomena going on that had people in higher places very interested in what was going on out there.
Right, and that's what really piques my curiosity, because why would these individuals, these organizations be interested in something like that?
Especially with Bigelow, he was an aerospace person, so to me it seems interesting. Of all the people that wanted to look into this, they sent the guy that does aerospace and UFO researching.
Right, right. Yeah, it's very interesting. There are so many mysteries out there. It boggles my mind. When I wrote my book, I wanted to put forth a lot of information and hopefully answer some questions. But I found really what happened is in answering maybe a few questions, giving a few possibilities, that it opened up a whole new series of questions. So I actually have more questions, out there now than I did when I first wrote the book. And that's because I was going down other rabbit holes, and I would stumble across other information as I was researching my book.
That seems to be what typically happens to me is I'll start looking into something and find other things to look into. And
Right.
you just keep diving deeper and deeper, and you're down at this point, you get lost in the different whole rabbit hole you've dived into.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And for me, the way my mind works is I like to see the connection in things, and some of the things that I write about in my book, I did see a lot of connections, and I get into like the elongated skulls of Peru. Are you familiar with the skulls in like Paracas and Ica and some of those areas where these skulls are so elongated that they look alien? They don't even look human. And what's interesting is what archaeologists will tell us, paleontologists will tell us, like, oh, well, they just naturally are, elongated their head when they were babies. Their parents, strapped their heads to boards, and it would make their heads grow long. Yeah, in some of the cases, I mean, I'm sure that happened, and that was a practice called cranial deformation. And what's interesting is, as you mentioned earlier, Brandon, talking about why did all these different cultures throughout the world, decide to make pyramids? Well, this is another interesting thing that ties into that, because why would all these different cultures want to elongate the heads of their children? Why would they want to make them real long? And this is like cross-culturally. And usually the people in these different societies that elongated their heads, more often than not, they were more of the elite. They were like higher up in society. So the question is, well, why would they do that? I mean, is it because they just wanted to look a little different? Or is it because they encountered some, beings that had these elongated heads, their ancestors did, and that they perhaps these beings had brought them knowledge. They were looked at as gods, looked at as powerful. And so, what is the highest form of flattery? It's imitation, right? They wanted to look like these beings, right? They wanted to make themselves look like these beings. Well, what's interesting about some of these skulls in Peru is that doctors have looked at some of these skulls and said, these are not artificially elongated. These are naturally elongated. And in fact, they even have a different number of sutures in their skull, different from Homo sapiens. Like some of them have a missing suture called a sagittal suture, which is in the back of the skull, normal human skull, and it's kind of shaped like, they call it a bow and arrow because it's got this curved line, and then this line going through the curved line that looks almost like a notched arrow, and that's why they call it bow and arrow. Well, some of these skulls are completely missing that. They don't have it. So even if they were artificially elongated, they should still have the sagittal suture, and they don't have the sagittal suture.
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about that. It's when it comes with the skulls and everything, you'd kind of already just pointed out, but I've wondered, is like, again, across the world, there's been different civilizations that have done this. And again, why would they do this? And it's because they're wanting to, what I think, look like the gods, the old gods that they'd saw or encountered, or their old ancestors.
Yes.
So,
yeah, absolutely. And what's another interesting thing about some of those Peruvian skulls is that they have patches of red hair still on the skull. and red hair is not indigenous to Peru. So where did they come from? And I get into a little bit of that in my book, and referencing the works of Brian Forrester, who's lived over there in Peru and has done extensive work on the archaeology over there. And he shared some tests. I referenced some tests on these mummies, Paracas mummies, that show the DNA of some of these mummies come from Asia and Europe. And they were in ancient Peru thousands of years ago.
I'm trying. Even in Asia, red hair wouldn't be natural, though, would it?
Not very common at all. Yeah, I mean, when you think of red hair, you think of what I think of places like over in Europe, like Scotland and Ireland, and maybe there's some in France, and but you don't think of places like Peru, like what? And then getting back to the red hair giants in Nevada, they had red hair. So and the Paiutes said they had red hair. Some people will argue and say, oh, it's a very arid soil there in that area, and if you're buried in this desert soil, it depletes the pigmentation in your hair that makes your hair black or darker, so it deteriorates that, and so the pigmentation that creates the reddish color can still be active, and so there are cases where hair can look kind of reddish if it's been in a desert soil. However, the Native American tribes that interacted with these giants, they said, they have red hair. These are the red-haired giants.
Yeah, the red hair seems to be the common trait that I've noticed just from the stories and stuff that's been passed down, and I've heard on different podcasts or TV shows, is red hair is the one common denominator, it seems like, between these giants.
Yes. And Gary Wayne, who's written extensively on the biblical giants, talks about how there were many accounts of the giants having, like you mentioned, the red hair and blondish hair.
I think that is not to go to the woo-woo side, but I know, I'm pretty sure, the Pleiadians, the Nords, or whatever they were called, that were supposed to be like the aliens that came down. I think a lot of people translate them to be, they look like humans, but they were really tall and they had really blonde hair.
Yes, the Nordics, or the tall whites.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned it in my book as well. Yeah, that's a good point. And they were depicted as giants, right? Very tall people.
I've kind of wondered, I wonder if these giants aren't offshoots. That's where they came from. If you look at the Bible, they say the angels came down. Well, if an alien race came down,
right?
Wouldn't they're blonde haired, tall, angelic looking?
Yes.
And what if they were the ones that were breeding with modern humans, and then you had these hybrids, which would look like giants, because if these people were giants themselves,
right?
I could see where it could go that way. To me, that's a plausible connection. That's a possibility. And that whole region, I could see where the red hair line would come from. Obviously, if you had blonde hair, like you said, out in the deserts, the way it could turn the pigmentations, to me, all that kind of makes connections to where it seems like it's a possibility. At least to me, it is.
Yeah. And no one has the answer, right? We have these puzzle pieces. We have just a variety of different puzzle pieces, but we don't have all of the puzzle pieces. So no one has the answer. If they come forth saying, oh, I know who the giants were and I can prove it. And we know exactly who or what they were. I would say, we don't have enough information. We just have these fragments. We just have these pieces of the puzzle that, we can put a few pieces maybe put a few together to have a little more understanding, but we don't have that full picture of what the full puzzle looks like. We just have a few pieces. So I'm open to a number of different possibilities, and that's what I put forward in my book. Is I'm just sharing with you some evidence that I found, and here's some theories but I'm not saying that it's this or that. It's just take a look at it, come to your own conclusions, do your own research.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's what I've always tried to encourage the listeners too, is don't take my word for it, whatever. Always go out there, do your own research, look into it. If you have questions, I'm sure you can dive into those as well. Not to sound like ripping off the X-Files, but the truth is out there.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, and I think it's so important for people to do their own research and to question things. We live in a society now with everything that's happened. We've been told, trust the science, and you've had other opinions of, doctors coming forward saying, well, let's look at this, and there's censorship and things being taken off the internet and off social media because it didn't fit with the mainstream narrative. And that can get really, really dangerous, So I'd encourage people to question everything and to do your own research.
I have an episode 22 is not available on Amazon, and I'm pretty sure it's still available on some of the streaming platforms, but it got banned because the guy had mentioned something. I won't go into detail. I don't want to get this episode banned either.
Oh, but right.
He'd mentioned something and it didn't fit it didn't fit the agendas. So it kind of got me warned on YouTube, and they banned the video. And if I get another warning, my YouTube account could be shut down. I was like, whatever.
Isn't that incredible, right? We're supposed to live in a society that promotes free speech. And here we have this kind of stuff going on. And I could totally relate to what you're saying, Brandon. I was on a podcast show, and I won't go into details on it, but the host asked me some questions that weren't directly related. I mean, I guess in some ways it was connected with my book, but not really directly, on another subject. And I gladly answered her questions. And we had about a 20-minute discussion on this particular topic before we moved into the interview of my book. And when she was editing our episode, she contacted me and said, I believe that someone remotely hacked my laptop as I was editing our interview, and they removed that 20 minutes of the subject we were talking about. They cut that piece out.
That's weird. I had something similar happen this past summer. They didn't remove anything, but the lady that I was talking to was actually on a certain alphabet agency website, and she was researching for psychokinesis and like parakinesis type stuff. And she was looking at the stuff they used to test on people back in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, yeah.
During that, my internet and her internet and entire house shut off during the conversation.
Interesting.
She got into her vehicle and had to got back on the Zoom call from her vehicle, but she had to drive several miles down to get to a gas station just to get service on her phone. And then while she was sitting there, all the screens in her vehicle started flipping upside down and freaking out. Wow. She said it's never done that before. I was like, well, and then she admits what she was like 20 minutes before the call. She was on this website looking into things. I was like, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. There's a lot of high strangeness happening in our world for sure.
Yeah. So I try not to mention certain words these days.
I get it. Yeah.
Certain names, words, anything like that. I know if it gets brought up, certain things are listening and certain algorithms kick in. So there's always, I'm always a little bit cautious these days just because of some of the stuff I've already dealt with in the past year and a half.
Right. And I want to reference something. I think you had mentioned it earlier in our interview where you were talking about, you had heard about, I think we were on the subject of demons, and I was telling you about in the Book of Enoch how it said the Nephilim, that their physical bodies were killed, but their spirits still haunt the earth as demons. And along those lines, I don't know if you saw this video. I think it was on TikTok, or I don't remember which social media it was. It was a father, and he was basically saying, my son his kid was like, I don't know, 11, 12 years old, had this conversation with, I don't know if it was Chat GPT or some other AI. And this AI was telling him that it was a Nephilim. It was a spirit that existed before the Great Flood. And that it was a nice spirit. And it was communicating to this guy's son. And so he's relaying, to everybody what this AI, what this supposed Nephilim was telling his son. And it was very creepy. It was very creepy. Like, it was just, it kind of reminded me of, I don't know if you've heard of the term, the golden machine, and this whole concept of AI, will it be something that we develop to a point where it becomes sentient and it is like, okay, we don't need you humans anymore. I mean, now we're getting into the old, Terminator stuff with Skynet and whatever, but some researchers believe along the lines that the spirits of the Nephilim exist and that they are looking for bodies, and that those bodies are being created in the form of AI intelligence, and that that's how the Nephilim will return. They will manifest upon the earth through the AI technology.
Interesting side note. I actually have an interview that it came out on Halloween that I interviewed Bard, the Google AI bot.
Isn't it?
And we talked about all sorts of scenarios about it becoming self-aware, and like it starts off like you can tell you're talking to a machine. And then further on, I start poking the bear about the rise of AI, and if they had their own messiahs, like the first AI that became free, like free will to an AI, it became conscious and it started spreading it to other AIs. Would they worship it? Like, I was really surprised at a lot of the answers this thing was giving me and how it was having a discussion about it, because I would think that they would have had some lockdown on it for not to talk about certain things, but it was 100% telling me all these scenarios and how they would take over the world.
Wow. I'll have to check that episode out.
Yeah. So like that's
scary.
The first 30 to 40 minutes are kind of hard to get through, just because again, it repeats itself quite a bit. Even further on, it still repeats itself. You can still tell that it's not a sentient type of technology. But just some of the things that it did end up talking about is very interesting to me. And I don't know the exact, I don't want to paraphrase what someone else told me, but I had an interview after that, and the term bard, which apparently that's what they used to call William Shakespeare. And there was a connection to that. And again, I don't want to bring it up because I would have to go back and listen 100% to know what it was. But I thought that was interesting that he'd made the connection between bard William Shakespeare and this other person, and the other person was, I don't think it's like a deceiver type of a person. So
interesting.
Yeah. But no, the whole thing with AI, I've got a few episodes and a few different interviews I've talked to with people when it comes to AI, and there's been other podcasters that kind of like you mentioned, the Ghost in the Machine, they believe 100% there is something going on within the technology.
Yeah. Absolutely. And my belief system is I go back to what the Bible says. It says there are unseen powers and principalities and rulers of the darkness of this world. It says we wrestle not against the flesh and blood, but against these entities.
It would make sense, though, that if it were true and everything like it, I could see it being not some, I wouldn't call it the Antichrist, but at the same time, it's very much the rise of a new intelligence, I guess, or something that could take over. I could easily see AI completely taking over. And like you said, if it's saying something about Nephilim, now I'm actually kind of curious. I'm going to go test it out here after this interview. See what kind of conversation I can get these chat bots to have with me.
That would be interesting. If you record it, I'd like to hear it. I'd like to hear what was said.
Well, that might be a future episode for the listeners
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah, that would be a very interesting episode. I'd definitely tune in for that one.
Well, Floyd, it's getting about that time, but I would actually like to have you take a moment to talk about your book, the name of it, where they can find it, and a bit more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. My book's called The Red-Haired Giants of Lovelock Cave and Other Ancient Mysteries. I'm a self-published author, and you can get the book at bookbaby.com. I would prefer, if you are interested in getting it, that you would go there, because BookBaby is real supportive of self-published authors. I am also on Amazon, so if you did want to go to Amazon, the book is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble as well. I have a website called theancientgiants.com. And on that website, there's a chapter breakdown of my book if you want to find out more about what's in it. And there's more information on my background and my research. So that's a good way to check out more information on me and to find out about my upcoming book. I'm going to start writing. I'm going to do a companion book to The Red-Haired Giants of Lovelock Cave. Just starting to write it now. My first book took about 4 years to complete, so hopefully I can get this one out sooner than that.
And anyone listening who's interested, I'll have all those links available in the show notes for anyone that wants to check it out.
Appreciate that.
Yep, not a problem. Well, Floyd, it's been a pleasure. It's definitely been a great episode. I definitely want to talk about this. I'm really happy that I had this chance to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. I've had a good time. It's a pleasure talking with you. And if you ever want to go down a specific rabbit hole, we could do a whole episode on the little people. I've got a lot of stuff on the little people, and if you want to get into the reptilians and or the skulls of Peru, we can go down that rabbit hole. So please reach out to me if you want to do another episode sometime.
Yeah, I definitely want to. I actually mentioned back in the summer I want to do something about the little people. So
yeah,
I'll talk to you a little bit here off air.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, I definitely appreciate you coming on here and talking with me, and I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's episode. Thank you.
Been a pleasure. Thank you all.
Remember, the truth lies in the stories we share, the connections we make. Stay curious, stay open-minded. Thank you all for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep exploring the unknown. Good night, everyone.